Hey there, I'm Ryan, and welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon. If you're interested, check it out. But with that, let's jump in and have some fun. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and I will dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, then proceed to wipe off the excess. This is just going to help us condense our bristles and help keep our paint wet for a longer period of time. With that, on our palette here, we have a cadmium yellow deep hue, a cadmium red medium hue, Mars black, titanium white, and a cerulean blue. We're going to start in the distance here with the background and our sky. So I'll begin by grabbing some titanium white, moving that to a clean spot on our palette. We'll grab about an equal mixture of that in our cadmium yellow deep hue. Then we'll grab about half that in our cadmium red because it is just quite a bit stronger. Now, we need to desaturate this pigment so that the orange in our sky doesn't compete with the orange within the flames. So I'll also grab a hint of Mars black using the corner of my brush, taking off the excess, and this is going to desaturate the pigment, making it so that, again, it doesn't conflict with our oranges later on. With that, I'm going to head up to the sky. I'll use that nice sharp edge of the brush to cut along where we are going to have clouds, and then I'll work it in and around a lot of the soon-to-be backing tree silhouette. Again, great to have these sharp edges on the brush, and I'm also using this brush because, as you can see, it can move a lot of paint very, very quickly, going over it twice. That way it's nice and thick. And I'm also going to take this pigment while we have it and work it right down in the reflection. Now, the reflection doesn't have to be a perfect representation of what we have at the top because we are going to apply foliage over top all of this, and there we'll have a lot of opportunity to make changes should we need to. But if we can get it fairly close from the beginning, we will make our lives easier later on. So, here we go. Mixed quite a bit of paint initially, so I should be able to do this without stretching it. Really want those thick applications because it will make your paintings look a whole lot more professional. With that, let's get you a little bit closer. Now, with a clean brush, we are going to grab some of our cerulean blue, move that off to a different clean side of the palette. We'll brighten it up with some titanium white, going in with about an equal mixture here. And then I'll grab yet again a little bit of Mars black. I'm dodging the yellows that are in those because we don't want them to mix with the blue and turn into a green. But we're essentially starting with a mid to dark blue that's relatively desaturated. We don't want too much saturation in the background because we don't want it competing with our foreground. And I think that's something a lot of people tend to struggle with when they start painting. They try to make every area extremely detailed, extremely vibrant, but we need some areas that are just going to be a bit more simplified. That way, our primary subjects can really pop, and there can be a flow in the painting. So, I'm going to start by creating my cloud with a very simple application. As you can see, really nothing to it, but we do need some depth. So, we'll grab some extra Mars black, mix that in. It's going to desaturate it. We'll apply that to the top. Essentially, the light here is going to be working its way upwards, brightening the cloud as we get towards the opening, but the top is and should be darker. Let's yet again make it darker. We do this progressively, just like that. Go over it very softly to eliminate those harsher strokes, and I think we're also going to incorporate some variance into our clouds. So I'll just tap in some of these darker strokes elsewhere, take off the excess paint, and then again soften it with a very, very small amount of pressure. And this is just going to diversify this open area of clouds. You can do a little tap to make it less linear if you want, a little more visually unique. But we do need to blend it into what we have there. So going back to the original color, I'm going to make it a bit more desaturated. So a little bit of extra white, a little bit of extra black, to the point where we're not really changing the value. It's not getting brighter or darker, but it is getting less saturated. We'll apply that down here towards the bottom. And we're trying to desaturate it because we're going to mix with the orange. And we don't want the orange, the yellow in the orange, and the blue in the clouds to make too much of a green. So we desaturate them both just a little bit. Then we go over here and we say, okay, desaturate it, white, black, not much of each, just like so. And now we create the transition. Little bit of each, working that along the edge. And then we can do a slight blend up into the cloud, just like that. You can see it's starting to get a little bit of a green. Can be avoided if our mix is slightly more red or if our blues are slightly more desaturated, but we can also create little areas like this where light is catching the bottom of other clouds and just brightening them a little bit. Easy way of adding some extra depth. But let's take that pigment off of our brush, head back to the regular pigment, not the desaturated version, and we can blend this up into the cloud very softly. There we go. Now it's going to look a little abstract for a minute before we start adding in the details and everything, but I want you to hang in there. Don't get discouraged. Meant to look this way, and it'll look a whole lot better in about 10 minutes. With that though, I want to take these colors and start doing the reflection now while we still have them on our palette and while things are still somewhat wet. So with that, we know that we need that transitionary color, which we still have here on our palette, and that can go right through here. I'm going to be painting over the image of the fire, and I often get asked the question, why do the initial drawing if you're just going to paint over it? And the answer is that it's just great practice. It familiarizes you with the subject so that when it comes time to really render it, you have a good understanding of it. The space where you want it to be. Sometimes you draw it on and you decide, you know what, I want it to be a little bit more to the left. Things of that nature, right? With that, we're going to continue moving down, which means we need something a bit darker. And it's also worth noting that reflections typically are darker than what they are reflecting. It's a general rule. So we'll start moving down. You can see I'm already going with the darker pigment. Cerulean blues making it really nice and rich. If you want it to look a little bit warmer, you could go with an ultramarine blue. And that would actually also look quite nice. But we're going to get something a little bit different here than what we normally do. Now this is water. So I am going to leave in some brush strokes as we work our way downwards. Grab some extra Mars Black. Look for where the sand is. I'm going to apply a couple of strips of this Mars Black. Here you can see that one goes through the middle, the other one's a bit closer to the bottom here. And now I want a brighter version where we essentially are going to meet the shore. Get a combination of all of those. There we go. So you can see it goes from bright, dark, dark. And it follows the general pathways. Now I'm going in and I'm doing a little bit of softening. If you want an area to stick out a bit more, we can have that happen. Just don't apply as many of those smoothing applications, and don't be as soft with them. So something a bit more like that. That said, again, let's get you a little bit closer for some of the blending. Now I'm cleaning my brush a little bit because I do want to go back into my oranges, and I want to do so without a massive amount of blue on my brush. So we'll grab this, we'll apply it right in between the two, just like that. Have it start to work down a little bit. We're getting those really soft blends because all of this is still wet. The top can't stay the same, but we can always remix that initial color that we had at the top and reapply it. Going to be careful to dodge the blues and the white mixture there. Need quite a bit of titanium white, a little bit of Mars Black. There we go. I think it needs to be a bit more red. And a bit brighter. Working relatively quickly. That way I can get to all of this before everything starts drying. But it's not a huge concern because we can always do a wet into dry blend. So there we have the edges. And now we can start bringing it down, having something that's a bit more reminiscent of the top. We have a very dark base to work into. And it's all fairly similar in terms of our application style to what we've been doing previously. But again, I'm leaving more brush strokes in there, being a bit more loose. There we are. Again, very abstract looking for now, but we trust, and I think we'll end up with something pretty great. Now we get to have some fun working with the foliage that we have up here. We're going to make it fairly blue, very dark blue, just because it's essentially in the shadows. Light isn't hitting it, light is on the other side of it. So we'll grab a lot of our Mars Black, a little bit of our cerulean blue, kind of work in something similar that we had at the bottom, and then we'll just start blocking in this middle area. And that's actually quite dark. I think I'm going to brighten up just a hint, very specifically, so that the massive amount of contrast doesn't take away from the foreground. Again, something we've talked about a couple of times, but needs to remain in the back of our heads for really the entirety of this painting lesson. Now, I am just going to start by doing a very basic fill. We are avoiding the edges for now because I want to do that with a different brush. There we go. And we need a little bit more light in this side. Just grab some titanium white, work that in. There we go. Let's grab a different brush. Now I'm going to be switching over to a small filbert brush. This one's about 1/3 of an inch, and it'll be great for working on the detail in all of our foliage. So what's going to happen here is I'll grab some more of that Mars Black, a little bit more of the titanium white, cerulean blue, remix the color that we were previously working with. And now we're going to create the implication of foliage by doing a tap and rotating our brush in the process. And we're doing this along the edges, getting far more detail than what we could have achieved had we worked with the 1-inch flat-headed brush. The sharp corner and edge of that brush is great for detail work, but what we need here is a bit more unique and a bit more finite. So, we're just going to start giving our foliage some character. And you can do this through a wide variety of tree types. In the reference photo, things are fairly nebulous in that we can't really distinguish the trees. There's a bit of a blur due to the camera lens that was used, probably shot with a low f-stop. But that means we can kind of interpret the trees how we'd like. If we want pine trees, if we want maple trees, maybe whatever's kind of in your comfort zone. Something that means something to you, right? So I'm just working my way, essentially from left to right, occasionally jumping around, and you'll see that I do kind of get distracted and move to a different area, and I do that intentionally so that if I'm kind of subconsciously working in a pattern, I break that pattern, or at least I instigate it somewhere else so it's not as obvious, and it gives me time to figure it out and break it. And we essentially want to ensure that we aren't continuously making the same markings or clusters of foliage trees, because when we do that, we run the risk of making it look a little cartoony. Often, cartoons are simplified iterations of what subjects actually are. And that's why when we don't apply enough detail, or when we just don't apply enough continuously changing detail, things can look that way. But often, simply adding diversity, even to a simple subject, is enough to get it out of that realm. Here, we're just continuing to work our way around. Also, if you find that you have to remix your pigment a couple of times and it's starting to be a little bit different from the original pigment, just go in and do a little tap, rotate, same technique that you were incorporating previously, and it will get rid of that potentially noticeable distinction with ease and efficiency. Also, in regards to mirroring what we have at the top, again, I'm not making it absolutely perfect because we are applying it fairly randomly, but I'm looking for the same general movements, the same general clusters, and trying to respect those. We're also going to incorporate some movements in the water, again, not really present in the reference photo, but something I think we can add, and that will add a lot to the painting. There we go. Now, let's make it look a bit more like a reflection. We can take that same pigment and work it essentially horizontally, but I'm going to add it on a slight angle so that it works in conjunction with that greater movement that we've already started to instigate. And this is going to look a little awkward for a minute, which is something you hear me say a lot through this lesson. Acrylics, the way that you paint, typically means that your painting has to go through a couple awkward phases, just because you're building thin layers and you're kind of applying a lot of foundations which don't see the end result for 15, 20 minutes, maybe even half an hour, depending upon the subject. But because of that, you need to have faith in yourself, in the project. I always try to show a fairly finished version of the painting in the little preview of these videos so that you can see that we do get to a place where it does look great. And that way you can carry that confidence forward, because I hate it when people jump in, they're excited about the lessons, and then all of a sudden it looks a little off on their canvas and then they don't end up finishing when they could have done an amazing job, right? So do consider that. Now I'm going back to the sky color, and in the same way I worked those horizontal lines over it, I'm now working them into what we have here. There we go. And this is going to give it a bit more of a reflective quality. We don't want to go overboard, but it is going to help. And the nice sharp edge on this brush will do the job well. Also, fun fact, we are working with the test set of brushes that we'll be launching later this summer. For years, I've just used a random collection of brushes because I've never found a set that had everything I wanted for these lessons. And it was always just this amalgamation. People asked, well, what brushes should I buy? I never really knew how to answer it because I personally hadn't found a singular set that I would recommend. But we are making this one, and you will have it in just a couple of months. It's a very small set. It's only 5 brushes, but that's because I only think you need 5. And I don't really, I don't see the point in having people pay for brushes that they just don't need and they're not going to use, you know? So, a small set it'll be, but all of the brushes will be versatile. With that, we still have to incorporate a little bit of land in here. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my blue, hint of white, really not much, but double that in Mars Black, and we want a grayish blue that's brighter than what we have here. Then I'm going to take my pinky finger and I'm going to create that dividing line, which is our land. Work it across through a variety of strokes. I'm doing it through numerous strokes. That way I have a bit more control. It's also just going to look more natural if it's not absolutely a perfect line. To make it slightly brighter for the second application. Just like that. A lot of us think of the ground as brown and sand being brown because typically that's how we see them, but we have a lot of cool light, a lot of shadow on this. So it's actually going to adopt all of those blues. And we'll do a slight blend back with it so it gets lost into that distance. Now this next step is something you can do, but you don't have to. What I'm going to take is some yellow, about half that in our red, titanium white, hint of Mars Black. We are rebuilding the color that we had here. Many of these rebuilds tend to need more red, so that's just a good thing to note for your mixing. Now it needs to be a bit brighter. We have the titanium white. It needs to be less saturated, so more Mars Black, but very, very small amounts because as you can see it quickly can change. And then we can take that color that's in the sky and create the bottom of some clouds. We already hinted at it with those strokes that we had, but essentially you want to apply this And you do a little bit of a tap, a little bit of a drag, that way your clouds have slight tails to them. And then you do a very soft tap and drag upwards, and you let it dissipate into the top. And what this does for you is gives you the appearance of light catching the bottom of a cloud, working its way up, and slowly losing that. But you want to start an area that is fairly bright at the bottom, and then as it works its way up, it gets darker. Soften it a little bit with some finger painting. Never too old for that. And again, it's not something you have to do, but it is an option should you want a little bit more detail in your sky. Though remember, we want the majority of our detail down below. There we are. Okay, so from a distance, I think the painting is starting to find itself. Still lots of refining that we could do there, but I do want to continue moving forward. That way we have a better idea of what the foreground is going to look like, and therefore how we balance it with the background better. So I'm going back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush. We're going to start working on the foreground, and we'll do so initially with the outskirts, which are going to be a bit cooler. So I'm going to grab our good old cerulean blue, and for the first time I'm going to grab some burnt umber, which we have right here on the palette. Grab about an equal mixture, give us a nice earthy blue. We'll darken it up with Mars black, not too much, and then we'll go to our titanium white, grab about half that of the Mars black, and work that in. So here we're just mixing a nice, cool, earthy blue. And I'm going to start applying this right along this corner. I'll make it darker as we get towards the corner because we're moving farther away from the fire. So it makes sense within the context of the painting, but we're also just creating a bit of a vignette in the painting to draw the eye inwards. Now, we'll continue working in, grab some of our burnt umber, work that up. Trying to do it close to my previous mixtures, that way I can compare them. And this time we do want more of that brown. We can get a little bit more titanium white than we did before. And that can be our next pigment, though it definitely does need to be brighter. Just like that. You can see that we're wrapping it. We can work this around the individual branches, or you can cover them up and redraw them on. As per usual, the traceable will be up over on Patreon, so you can print that out if you'd like, or use a mini projector, use tracing paper, or just use the grid to freehand sketch it. But don't be afraid of covering it up. Again, it's an asset to have, even if you do. Familiarizes yourself with the subject before you get to it a couple of times. Now, I'm going to continue making this bottom area a bit darker, as you can see, especially the corners. And it's going to look, admittedly, a little dull for about 10 minutes. That's okay. It's also worth noting that we're painting sand. So typically we go for these perfect gradients. Here, I'm not doing that. If I can get it to look a little granular, that's great. If I can see the tooth of the canvas a little bit, awesome. Doesn't need to be hyper smooth. In fact, it's better if it isn't. Now, as I get even closer, we're going to take some of our Cad Red Work that into the mixture with a little bit more of our burnt umber. Work that up along the top here. And it's a little bit too red right now, but when we start blending, it certainly won't be. It's also not touching the middle area yet. We are going to use another pigment for that transition. But I am going to take that red, I'm going to work it out into our previous applications. I'm working my brush in a bit of an X-shaped pattern. That way I don't only move the pigment vertically or horizontally, it's moving both. Let's get you a little bit closer though. Something I'm realizing is it's just too dark at this point. So we'll grab some extra titanium white, extra burnt umber, extra cad red, and this is really quite bright. However, it's going to blend with what we already have on the canvas, so the pigment I'm applying right now isn't this pigment, right? It's a combination of the pigment on the palette and what we have on the canvas already. So it's going to be darker here. And I feel like we can move this farther up. You can see this brush is great for just cutting along those sharper edges and branches. Now I'm moving into the rest. Typically I wouldn't drag paint this far because it thins it and you can get a bit more of a granular texture because you're not just working with a lot of paint anymore, we're working with much less. But again, in sand, that's not a bad thing. There we go. Let's grab a bit more of this, work it up at the top, covering all of those little sticks for now. It's okay. Let's get a darker variant of it. As we get farther away from the fire on the other side. And we can kind of scrape this into the water a little bit, trying not to get a hard edge, but rather a softer one. We can go back in with the water and create a proper blend a little bit later, but for now, that should work. I also, yet again, want to go in with something a little bit brighter for that middle area. A bit more titanium white. And we're just slowly working it, building it up. Making a nice warm center that's earthy. And then my semi-soft blend outwards. This is something you'll probably want to do a couple of layers on. If not adjusting the color, just building it up. And we also need to make it look significantly more disheveled than it currently does. That's a big goal we'll have in the near future. That said, we'll start making it look a bit darker as we move up there. Get a little bit of blue, mix that with our red, mix that with our brown, Mars black, hint of titanium white. There we go. Really nice. Almost gets lost in the background. And blends well with what we already have up here. Again, lots of refining, values and hues until we get to what we actually want. Okay, so I let it all fully dry to the touch, And as you can see, the layers are very thin. We did a lot of dragging to get that kind of sandy textured look, and as a result, we didn't get a lot of thick application. So we have to go in, do another layer, but much like having to do drawings multiple times, going in and doing multiple layers is great because every time, typically, it gets a little bit better. We learn as we go, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start up here. It's the thinnest spot, and I want to move water onto the land. So I'll grab some of our blue, Mars black, titanium white, not much titanium white, but I essentially want something fairly similar to what we have in the water, as you can see. I'll move it in a similar pattern to the water itself. You can even splash a little bit of that into that general area. Then I'll start bringing that into the land. Now we have a very harsh line. Not what we're looking for, but that's okay. That will be useful for the blend. Cleaning the brush off. Grabbing some of our burnt umber. A little bit of our blue. Not too much. Titanium white. And more burnt umber with a hint of Mars black. And this will act as a transitionary color. It's not the brightest. It's not the darkest. Apply that right there. And then we'll do a smooth blend back into the water. And this way it looks like the water is coming up onto the land. We can see through it slightly, but not all that much. Right? And as we continue to progress with this transition, every time making it a bit more bright, a bit more brown, and eventually a bit more reddish orange, we'll get that transition we want. Here yet again, just taking it off my brush very softly, getting that nice granular texture. Not afraid of going over these lines and going in for the blend. There we go. See that? Nice and easy. Let's continue adding titanium white, burnt umber, and now our red. Hint of our yellow. Have to be careful with the yellow though. We need it to be red dominant, otherwise the yellow and the Mars black will mix and make a bit of a green. Or the yellow and the blue will make a bit of a green. A really nice color right there. Just have that work its way back, like so. You can see just how much better this next layer is already looking. Work that out from the center. I want it to be slightly brighter. This is of course why we don't just stop at layer 1, and why we shouldn't be afraid of going back and doing things over again. And this is how we really take advantage of acrylic paints. See, I'm not going to the first mix I get. It's a lot of iterating to get it to that next step. That's a beautiful pigment. Just work that out from the middle. Don't want it to go too far. Now, we'll need to desaturate it a little bit and bring it back to the norm. So we'll go with that bluish brown. Bring that up. A little painting ASMR there. Just hear that brush on the canvas. We need to start working our way up. Adding a bit more blue and a bit more Mars black as we move farther away from the fire, but still keeping that burnt umber. Looking a lot better with the thick layers, but still a world of details and applications to go. For these details, we're actually going to be using two new brushes. That includes the stiff bristled fan brush and a small liner brush. Great for details in different scenarios. However, I'm still going to mix my paint with the 1-inch flat-headed brush because it can carry a lot more paint and it's just going to be much more efficient on the actual palette. So I'll start by making sure that brush is nice and damp. We're going to mix up a mid to dark pigment, very similar to what we had in the sand right through this mid section. And we're essentially going to recreate all of the colors that we had if we don't still have them wet on our palette. So we'll just create something nice like this. It also doesn't have to be absolutely perfect in mirroring the previous pigments, but something close will help. Now we'll go to our fan brush. I'll grab that on both sides of the fan brush. I don't want too much paint on either side though. And then I'm going to go on and tap some texture, essentially by rotating my brush, always touching in with a different point. And what you want to avoid is getting a strict line with your taps. When we go in with this, we're looking for a lot of variation, a lot of randomization. And so you see me rotating it quite a lot. I'm not trying to bring it all the way into the middle either. I essentially want to do this in an area where it matches perfectly, and then I slightly move it upwards to give a very subtle look of added detail. And we're essentially just looking to create little mounds of sand that have shadow behind them, this being the shadow. Also little pieces of wood that may have burnt up and flew off. Little rocks. There are so many tiny little pieces that can exist within the sand. And getting this texture, this very subtle texture, is a great way of beginning that process. That said, we don't want much paint on our brush at any point because we don't want our bristles to condense. There we go. So I'm not going to mix paint with it when we need more. And you know what, let's go with a slightly darker mixture, a little bit more brown, a little bit more blue, definitely a lot of Mars black in here. A little bit more of that. Okay. And now I'm going to do this a little bit farther down than I did previously. You can see I'm really rotating that brush, and I'm rotating the brush very specifically in the air, not once the brush touches the canvas. Because if it touches the canvas and I rotate it, then I'm going to get a skewed marking, and we don't want that. We can also just use the corner to add on little bits. You can see that occasionally we do get some line work, and that essentially just looks like little branches, which isn't the worst thing, but you do want to be a little bit careful not to do too much of that, because we will be adding the branches with a liner brush in a later step. Right now, we just want a little bit of that texture. And initially it's going to make it look messy, but I guarantee you it adds so much life and realism to this as we come towards the end. Be careful not to add too dark of an application up towards the top brighter area, by the way. And there we go. Really building up a lot of it. But we're doing it slowly, over time, not rushing it. Okay, I'm going to put that brush down. I'm going to head back to my palette. We're going to make the brighter variant of all of this now. Titanium white, burnt umber, hint of Mars black, cad red, a bit more cad red, yellow, and we still have that pigment up there, great for remixing too. I always try to keep a little bit of every color that I've mixed on my palette somewhere. And sometimes we just don't have enough space, but it's a great habit to get used to. There we go. I think it needs to be just a hint darker. Typically when I pick up Mars Black, I end up putting a little bit of it down. Still going to this brush. We can wipe off the excess pigment, but we don't want to make this brush wet or damp because we don't want to condense the bristles. We will have to commit to cleaning it at some point when the paint begins to dry, but we don't want to do anything to it beforehand. Now here we have a slightly brighter, it could also be a slightly darker mixture than what you have at the top. And we're going to work that down into the rest of the sand. Now, because we're working with a pigment that isn't super dark, we do want to, again, try to avoid the longer markings that we could get away with looking like sticks when we did the darker pigment. However, sticks will have highlight from the fire itself, so you can have a couple. You can have a couple little lines of this, but do be careful. We started with the dark ones for a reason. Give us that practice before we jump into the more stark pigment. And for this, I'll probably just use the corner of the brush quite a bit more than I will actually using a side or real portion of it. There we go. You can see we're bringing that down. It's a bit of a long clip here, I know, but I'm really trying to show that we don't rush this part. Let's take a second break, take a look at the canvas from a bit of a distance. Okay, so it's definitely starting to look better, a bit more textured, a bit more real, but we do have a long ways to go. So let's get back up and close to it. I think what we really need is more of a transitionary pigment in between here, so nothing as dark as this, but nothing as light as this. And my answer for figuring out what I want is just going to be to mix the two, keep it nice and easy. You can still see the darker pigment over here, you can still see the lighter pigment over here, so if I want to remix them, it isn't hard. We still have those references. And that is a great transitionary pigment. Love that. Now I want something a bit darker yet again. And this is really a lot of apply, see if you like it. Apply, see if you like it. Also, we have been painting very up close, but I would strongly recommend throughout the painting process of this and every other painting you do frequently take 5 to 10 steps back away from the canvas and see what it looks like from and afar. Because typically, people don't look at art from half a foot away. They look at it from half a room away. And when we paint really close to the canvas, we can get in a bad habit of saying, oh, you know what? I could add more detail here, or I could really fill this out. I could do this or that. And in the process of doing so, typically we overwork our subjects. We add too much detail to the point where they don't fit in context with the rest of the painting. But when we step back, we start to notice that. We start to notice if something's too detailed, too saturated, not saturated enough, maybe if it needs to change the hue. All of that becomes so much more apparent when we're farther away. So do try to do that. Another thing you can do is set up a mirror on the other side of your room, so you can kind of just look backwards, look into the mirror, it'll show you the painting, but the painting will look very far away. So that's an easy way of going about it. Typically, also, I wouldn't move this far up with such a dark pigment, but I have almost none left on my brush. So what is coming off is very subtle. And it isn't as dark or stark as what we were initially applying around the bottom and edges. Same with what I apply back here. I don't want it to be stark. I want something subtle. There we go. Okay, now I am going to clean that brush a little bit, get that paint off, and we'll retire that brush until it is dry. In the meantime, we're grabbing the liner brush, making sure it's nice and damp, grabbing that same pigment, and we're going in and we're painting little rocks. Now, the liner brush, while small, is going to render larger markings than what our fan brush did, because we were working with individual little bristles there, where this is still a collection of them. But it's great for creating these semi-larger subjects, which there are actually an abundance of. With this, sometimes I make them small by applying a very small amount of pressure. And then when I want a larger rock or area of shadow in the sand, I apply more pressure. The bristles expand on the brush. I get a larger application. And it's nice and easy. That said, we also want to incorporate things like branches. Now, as noted, we covered up a lot of them. I know there's one right here. I'm just looking at my reference photo. And I can just paint that in like that. Grab some extra water. This, again looking at the reference photo. Reference photo, of course, will be up over on Patreon, but also just linked in the video description. And a lot of the primary ones will be drawn onto the traceable, which you can also find up over on Patreon. If you're new to the channel, by the way, Patreon is essentially how we make all this happen. Keep the lights on, as they say. Really wouldn't be able to do this without all the incredible support that is shown up there by the community. So big thank you to everybody who does support the channel up over on Patreon. You did make this lesson happen, and I'm incredibly grateful that I get to do what I do, in large part because of you. But again, for those of you who are new and might not be aware, up there is where you do get the traceables for all of these to help you with the drawing process. You can find things like the reference photos, images of all of the paints and brushes that I use when I post each of the new lessons. You can also get all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially The essential is everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. We talk about blending, mixing different colors, what brushes to use, how to work with water, composition. Again, just about everything you need to know. Additionally, there are ebooks full of traceables for there's days where you want to paint something, you want to make something, but you're not really sure what that is. Lots of those up there. And we also have fun things like an exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their renditions of these pieces, which is always really fun to see. You know, I think that everybody kind of takes it in a little bit of a different direction, interjects their own likings towards it, and it's always great to see such a supportive community. I say it in a lot of these lessons, but I'm really proud of the people that we have up there. I'm really proud of what this community is. I feel like it's only ever kind and supportive words up there. And when people ask for help, you know, there is that support. There is, you know, how do we move forward? But it's always done in a really respectful way. And I think that's so important. So if you are one of the people up there who's actively engaging, leaving comments, supporting your fellow artists, big thank you to you for doing so in the way that you do, because I do love and respect it. And because of you, people feel encouraged, people continue painting, and that's a beautiful thing. So thank you for not only supporting the channel, but for, again, just having a great, larger impact as well. Here, bouncing back towards a lot of the tapping, really building this up. I think we probably spent 20 minutes on just this little area of sand. But when you have this high contrast light, you have a lot of opportunity to make sand a whole lot more interesting than it is during the day. Grabbing a bit more. Love this texture. Now we're going to do something fun, but we're going to do it from a little bit farther away because it would be very easy to overdo. We're going to take some of our yellow, titanium white, cadmium red, again about half that titanium red that you do with the yellow, hint of Mars black, take off the excess. We'll mix that about. Need to add a little bit more red because the Mars black and the yellow made it a hint green. And what we're going to do with this is tap on little mounds of sand that catch extra light. So areas that are raised. And you can do this through a little bit of a drag if you want, but I'm going to do it predominantly through a tap. Similar to what we were doing with the fan brush, but we are making larger markings, and we're making them at a slower pace because we're using a singular brush. It's really going to be noticeable as we move out to these outskirts. So maybe you have a little piece of wood that sparked up, found its way over here. It has a bit of an extra highlight to it. There we go. Again, not trying to overdo it. That's why we're painting a bit farther back. And by the way, I try to share this tip in every video as well. Don't hold your brush like this. If you're standing farther back and you need more distance, hold it like this. You relinquish control. It's harder to paint purposefully, but it lets you get farther away, and it helps you randomize more, which is important in scenarios like this, because it's another one of those steps where subconsciously pattern can kind of kick in and give you something that's very visually samey, which you don't want. You want that randomized factor. So giving up that control is actually a really good thing in this scenario. That said, we can always go back and add more of this. So I think we should go with the less is more idea and leave that for now. However, we are going to have highlights on a couple of our branches. And I'm just going to apply the start of that right now. It's not going to be on every branch. And you need to think about which area of your branches are going to be receiving this extra light. All of the angles that are essentially facing the fire. And this is how we're going to build some depth down here. You don't have to do it through individual elongated strokes. If you do so by applying a little bit, taking a little bit of a break, applying a little bit, it'll look much more natural. Again, keeping you fairly far back, despite the fact that this is a very detailed thing, just so you can see how subtle it all still is. Okay? Make sure that yours does too. This isn't meant to be a grand application. Now we're going to get quite a bit closer, grab our 1-inch flat-headed brush, make sure that it's nice and damp, and we'll start a very dark mix with a little bit of blue and a little bit of red. Typically, blue and red make a purple. However, cerulean blue and cadmium red typically desaturate each other a little bit, but it'll give us a bit of hue as well as a hint of our burnt umber. We're painting wood, but we don't want too much burnt umber. This wood is going to be very much affected by the warmth around it. And here you can see that I'm starting to paint in all of the little logs. Now I did draw them off camera just so I could make sure that they were right. And typically when I draw, my hand is in the way the entire time. So it's just one of those things. But if you need to redraw yours, again, you can either go back to the start of the video where it is shown, or you can use the traceable, or you can get extra creative and come up with your own design for them. None of those options are wrong. I typically like to work with a reference photo or something from life just because it allows me to incorporate elements that I innately wouldn't think to incorporate. Typically, a lot of us, when we go to paint subjects or draw subjects for the first time, our natural inclination is to kind of oversimplify them because our idea of them in our head kind of comes from how we've seen it represented in art as young ones, right? So what we'd see in cartoons and things of that nature. But we want it to be a bit more detailed than that. So I typically don't trust my own imagination for real detail work, but that's just me. You could be different. It's just something important to consider as you work through these processes. Here you can see I'm being very, very mindful of my edging. We can go back with a smaller brush later and touch it up, but I do want a nice, thick, clean layer right now. Typically that's done best by working the edges first, and then we work into the middle. And it's done in that way because when you have clean paint on your brush, when you just grab new water, you have the best opportunity to render sharp line work. So we start with the edge while we have that ability. And then as we start to run out of pigment, like now, I'll move in towards the middle of the larger logs and fill them in. There we go. Lots of them crisscrossing. This is a little bit too thin. You can tell, you can see the canvas through it. That's just because I had more water on my brush. It's okay though. Nothing a second layer won't fix. But I do want to wait for it to dry a little bit before I add that second layer, because it will take to the canvas a whole lot better if it is closer to dry. You can see we're following this one all the way up. Starting with our edges. The logs aren't perfect, they're not meant to be. We want those unique little bends, cracks, changes. Will make a big difference in the long run. There we go. We're going to have fire covering a lot of this. However, it's good to get a base in there. That said, let's get you a little bit farther back so you have an idea of scale. So here we are yet again from a distance. And I do think it's really important that we look at the painting up close frequently, but also far away. Again, just so you can see what it'll look like in a room and get that wider view to ensure that everything is as cohesive as we need it to be. Now I'm just starting to work the more prominent ones in, just kind of looking at the reference photo and assessing which branches are going to be more visible. I'm also making a couple artistic liberties, a couple of small changes, just because I know that I'm going to want this to look a little bit different. Photographs are great for giving you additional information, making sure that it's a bit more real, that we don't oversimplify. However, typically we can change subjects to make them compositionally work better, because naturally their compositions may be good and you may be able to capture that in a photo, but they're very, very rarely perfect. And in this process, we can make them close to it, and at least work better within the larger context of the piece. Going over a lot of this, just giving it that second layer. Leaving a couple openings, which we will just apply fire in. There we go. So yet again, we're going to get nice and close, and we'll grab our 1/3 inch filbert brush. Then we'll make sure it's nice and damp. Grab some of our really nice cadmium yellow deep hue, about half that in our cad red medium hue. Hint of titanium white. Some burnt umber. Really just about everything with the exception of the cerulean blue. And right now we're mixing a warmer hue to go on top of some of the logs. So the fire is going to be coming up through here, which means it's going to be casting down a reflection on a lot of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start really close to the actual fire, or rather where it will be. And then I'm going to start moving outwards with my highlight on the top of a log, and I let it dissipate as I move this way. So there are less taps, less drags. That said, I also want to do a little bit of a blend down, so I'm going to take that pigment and I'm going to drag it down very, very softly. Try to get a natural gradient, just like that. We'll start on another log right here. Again, letting it dissipate, getting softer with my touch, and then I'll go back and I'll apply more paint closer up to the top here. Let's do it again. So there is a easily followable pattern in this application. Because we're painting wood, it doesn't all need to be perfectly clean lines and strokes. We can have some texture in there. We can see the tooth of the canvas showing through, and I actually like that look a lot on subjects like these. There we go. You can see that this is something we can apply almost everywhere. Just like that. And this is a great brush to deliver all of the paint because we have that top point that's very sharp, but we also have those rounded edges which are nice for the blends. Essentially it just lets us do everything that we want to. So, with that, we continue. I have really clean water on the brush, fresh paint. So I'm just doing some of the more detail-oriented areas. I might go back here and just create a little bit of wood grain. So I'm just essentially moving like this to create a slight pattern to make the look of grooves and inset areas. And everywhere that we paint right now is essentially an area that's lifted. The light is coming down, it's touching it, it's rolling down it into a crevice where you get those darker areas. But it's a really easy way of adding some natural detail into the wood. And much like all of our other applications with it, if it's a little bit toothy, it's a good thing. Now we also need to work on these, and typically we're painting on the top and working our way downwards, but there are going to be pieces of wood that are actually inside the fire, like this one. So it's going to start at the top and be bright, and then as we work our way down, we'll let it dissipate, we'll apply less pressure, we'll let the paint run out, and you can see that gradient. I'm going to apply a little bit more pressure up here, relieve, 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 relieve. We know the pattern. There we go. That said, there are still a couple of areas to get. And we've essentially just started with a singular pigment, but we are going to go into this with a couple more. Really going to elaborate on what we have here. Now that I have almost no paint on my brush, I'm just working this over a little bit of that negative space, that darker area, just so everything has a slight hint of the same texture. It also softens the darker hue a little bit, which you don't have to do because it is your main subject, but I just want to make sure that it's cohesive with everything else. Now, yet again, we'll get a little bit brighter. So, titanium white, or yellow, or red. Probably don't need any extra burnt umber unless we accidentally make this too bright or vibrant. Let's go in, do a little test. Brilliant. Love that. It's not too much, but it does make it a bit more notable. Gives us some additional depth. The more layers of value you create, the more depth you have. It's through these gradients, even textured gradients, that you accomplish that depth. Now applying this is a lot easier than the last application because we already know what we're doing and where we're doing it. We're just doing more of it. There we go. Just going to clean my brush really quickly And we'll do this one more time. Again, getting brighter, more saturated. Not by a grand amount, but that should be good. We don't want this to overshadow the actual fire itself, and that is something we need to take into consideration as we work our way through this. It's meant to give the piece realism, build up our textures and our layers, make the wood look natural, but it's not meant to be what takes all of our attention. Again, going in quite softly in the areas that aren't hyper prominent. In the areas that are like this, we go in with water on the brush, clean paint. You also notice how all of these are overlapping each other. Does so much for building depth. There we go. Great. Now, we need to make areas fairly deep red. So, we have the regular softer glow, but where we have the real heat, we're going to have something quite a bit more in the cadmium red spectrum. We'll grab a small hint of titanium white, not much because we don't want to turn it into a pink. We'll grab a small hint of Mars black, and we'll just grab a little bit of that burnt umber to make it slightly more earthy so it's a bit cohesive, right? Now we're going to have a lot of fire in this bottom area, so under this piece of wood we're going to get that really warm heat reflecting up here. Same with this one. Going to get it a little bit in there. And if you want, you can fill in the negative space with this. But this is what we reserve to really show the heart of that fire. We're also going to have a little bit of it glowing on the ground. So I have a lot of water on my brush right now, which means I can essentially do a glaze where I don't disturb the actual previously applied line work. I just add a hue on top. That's just done with a very small amount of paint and a good amount of water, but it gives us that nice heat that we need. So far so good. Let's take a step back. So, we're getting there. It definitely isn't too bright, which is great. We can always go back and brighten some of that up if we want to. However, what I want to do now is make it look more realistic as a whole. And we're going to do that by applying shadows underneath a lot of these, and we can even do it to our little branches down here. So for this, we're going to take quite a wet brush. We're going to grab a little bit of Mars black, work that in a clean spot on our palette, a little bit of burnt umber, cad red, hint of our yellow, hint of our white. But predominantly we want this to be red, black, and burnt umber. Then again, want to make it incredibly thin, so I'll just move a little bit to the side of my palette, clean my brush, grab some water on my brush, and essentially thin it out to the point where it is like a watercolor. Then I'll go in here and I'll say, okay, you know what? We have a lot of light that's going to be coming up from here. We have some from underneath, but not as much, so this will create a stronger shadow than this will be able to handle to an extent. So what I'm going to do is, I say this is right here, light's coming down, that means directly under it, we have a shadow. However, as we get closer to the light in here, it's going to dissipate because it's going to get brighter. So I'm going to start from right here, work it inwards, and just let it dissipate as we get towards the center. The center is here, so this one's going to be a bit more horizontally applied. I do a little bit of finger painting here and there. go. And these are all quite thin applications. If you want, you can go back in and add additional ones. But you probably want to let it dry a little bit first before you go in and add multiple. Down here, again, we just mirror the sticks when they are off the ground in a little bit of a shadow because the light's coming this way, this way, this way, essentially circular, right? And I know you're quite far away, it's subtle. It's one of those steps where it should be very subtle, which is why you are a bit farther away. Just so you can see how not dramatic a lot of these applications are. That should be good. We might do more, but I do want to let a lot of this dry and just see how we feel about it. Now we're going to get a bit closer yet again, and as you can see, I just did a rough drawing of how I want the fire to be done. I did it with Conte, which is essentially chalk in different colors. I like it because it allows you to easily allocate different colors to different subjects, and also because it typically comes off with a little bit of water, doesn't bleed into your paint really. So it's just a great option for sketching on canvas that's already been painted. With that, I am going to grab our filbert brush, make sure it is nice and damp. Then we're going to create a darker orange. So something akin to these, but not too saturated. This is really our best reference point, and we're essentially going to be making the base of the fire hue. We'll build up on it. That is far too saturated. So we'll grab some Mars Black. That'll darken it. Now we'll lighten it. And the combination of the two should, as you can see, really desaturate it. It's a nice thick pigment, and we're going to go in with this. It's worth noting, some portions of your fire you want to be with thick pigment, some you want to be with thin. We're going to do a lot of the base work and work in the body with thick, and then as you get towards the edges, the top areas, the more detailed areas that won't have as much fire and therefore are more semi-transparent, we'll do that with a more thin mixture. But from that, I know that we can fill in all of the remaining white canvas that we have. So just slipping in between a lot of our wood, and we'll have this working, as you can see, on the side. You can leave little openings where you have nice finished areas. And we want this to go over top different portions. Here you can see it moves over this log, finds itself in this cranny, and then it's blocked by this other log. So we're going to look for ways like that of making it all look really three-dimensional. Here, we'll go over this log, and then we'll have it kind of get lost. Just like that. It's quite dark, so it's not going to look like fire just yet, but we will get there. It's all about having that patience, trusting the process. We've done quite a few fire lessons here on the channel. Try to do one annually, just because I really love it. And you get better every year. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this one turns out, but I do have faith. And you have seen the thumbnail, so you do know how it turns out. Now, as I get towards the top here, I'm letting my paint run out to a point so that my applications are more thin. You can see how it's really just taking off that drawing with ease because there's still a little bit of water on the brush, and the Conte really doesn't hold up with liquid, which is good. We don't need the drawing once we have the layer of paint on that we do. Still all very thin applications, leaving some of the centers semi-transparent. I think I'll leave the center of this one to be so. And you know what? I think we'll have a little bit of fire move its way around this log. So rather than doing a straight line, I'm working it like this. It's definitely coming. Let's get you a little bit closer. Now, as we move up and get towards some of our edges, I'm going to go in with a bit more of a watery mix. So I just didn't wipe off as much water from my brush this time. And that's going to allow me to get more sharp, concise strokes that are also semi-transparent. You can see just how clean a lot of these applications are. There we go. Much less opaque than what we have there, right? And we're really going to move up. Now I did change the top of the fire from the reference photo just because I felt like it was very much skewing the eye towards the right-hand side of the canvas. And I wanted it to be a bit more centered. There we go. And when we add highlights to all of this, it's going to look gorgeous. But we're just building the base. And we need to have this more orange, red, heavy base because we're going to be working on top of blues. And what happens if we apply a yellow on top of a blue? Even if the blue is dry, typically the yellow will look like a green. So that's why we apply the base that we do right now, so that when we apply our thin yellow applications, we don't find ourselves with a color we don't want on the canvas. Also, all of the little extra strands of Conte will be very easy to take off with just a wet wash of no pigment later on once the canvas is fully dry. Also here, you can see I'm going back in over some of my previously applied and now dried applications. And you can see that it's really brightening some of these. Because the first layer was so thin, we didn't really get to see it. But now I get to go back in and reassign areas that I do want to be a bit more opaque. So we almost have a practice round with the first application, and then it builds up. As so. There we are. You can see that I'm connecting a lot of little areas. Still keeping fairly true to the reference photo, but occasionally taking a liberty. Now it's time to build those highlights, but do so selectively. We're going to continue to work with the filbert brush, and we're going to mix up a brighter orange than what we were previously working with. However, we still wouldn't want it to be incredibly bright or incredibly saturated. We also want it to still be more orange heavy than it is yellow, though we will slowly work towards a more yellow mix. With that, I think we are fairly close to something quite nice here. We'll just add in a splash more of color, and that looks great. So I'm going to begin with all of this paint in an area that is going to be more opaque. So, more full area, one that's typically a bit wider, and one that we know we don't need to be too semi-transparent. Just like that. You can see just how much brighter it is in comparison to the previous applications. Trying to get more so the centers. Trying to get a little bit of a blend into the edges. with a soft touch and the edge of the brush which is rounded rather than the top which is sharp. Something I am using for the more detailed portions. There we go. It's all starting to tie together. Starting to achieve a little bit of depth, though it's still going to feel very incomplete. And will continue to do so until we start adding in all of the yellows and the almost white, the warm whites for the true highlighted areas. But we take it slow and we build up our layers. By adding this, we ensure that wherever we add that yellow, we won't get a green because it is quite thick, especially as a second layer to what we've already applied. And here you can see that I'm going in, adding in additional layers to our previously applied portions, and that's helping me get more of the natural color that was on the palette, because our first application is probably going to be more so a combination of what we have on the palette and what we already have on the canvas, because it's semi-transparent, right? And to get that color that's on the palette, we need to do a couple of layers. There we go. Starting to define that top portion a lot better. When we want the real details, we will switch to a different brush. But for now, this is quite successful. I think we'll get you a bit closer though for this next highlight. So you can wait for this to dry and apply the next layer, ensuring that you get more of the natural color that we mix on the palette. Or you can work wet into wet and get those really smooth blends. Neither option is wrong. It's really about personal preference, and I'd recommend trying both just so you can see what you actually like. I haven't waited, but by the time we mix our paint, it may have dried. With that, we're going to go for a brighter mixture, so I'm going to continue working down, keeping this past mixture. That way I can mix beside it and ensure that we are moving in the correct direction. See that? Slowly getting more yellow, slowly getting brighter. And that's a nice orange right there. We'll begin by applying this yet again in the heart of the opaque areas. Just like so. Like to start closer to the bottom as well. And then we work our way up. You can see we're getting a really soft application as it is blending with the previous pigment. However, it does mean it's diluting it to a point, and it's not quite as bright or yellow as what we have on the palette. It's not an issue though, because we can always just build up our layers. It essentially lets us do things more gradually. Which means it's slower, but it gives us a greater opportunity to course correct should we want to. Still trying to leave portions of that darker pigment along the edges. There we go. And I'm doing a little bit of blending using the edge of my brush. Nice and easy. Overlapping our wood in another portion, semi-transparent, gives it some extra depth. I do think we need to build up this larger flame a little bit. So I might expand it minorly. And you can kind of paint with more of this brighter yellow mix towards the bottom because we're not working on a blue, we're working on more of a
earthy orange brown color akin to all of that. I'm going to fill out the body a little bit. Yet again, we get closer and we get brighter. More titanium white, more of our cadmium yellow deep hue. We still need some red. We'll take off the excess, and you can see that the previous mixture is still there. So we have essentially stairs of them, which is really nice. And you know what? I was about to apply it with this brush, but I'm going to put that down. I'm going to pick up the liner brush, make sure it's nice and damp, because it can just deliver a much more intentional application. So here, we'll start working in the middle. You can see that I can't get even close to as much surface coverage as I could previously, but that's okay, because all of my applications are going to be incredibly sharp. Trying to follow through with that which we've already made. We're now starting to work significantly more so within the yellow. So I do need to be careful of not going over the blue. It's also worth noting that this is going to make your fire look a little bit stiff for a minute. Don't worry, we are going to find our way out of that. It's just a part of the process. You can also blend the edges if you want by going over them very softly. Create that minor gradient, especially if your brush is quite damp. There we go. It's looking a little playful now. It's good. Still far too dark for what we need. So we'll go over a couple of these applications again. There we are. Really coming together. Okay, let's get a little bit farther back just so we can paint and see the larger context. Starting to look a little bit better from a distance, but there is quite a ways to go. So, heading back into that center area. My brush doesn't have as much water in it, so you can see that I'm getting a bit more of an opaque look. So the color is more innately what it is on the palette, because we're not thinning it as much, so we don't get as much of that semi-transparent look and that blend with what's already on here. You get a nice flame that works underneath this log, comes out over it and this one. Looking for different ways of playing with the flame, wrapping it around these pieces of wood. That's how we're going to accomplish the best depth. There we go. That's really fun. Grabbing more pigment. Also, I'm holding my brush quite closely so that I get the details exactly how I want. However, we're working on a large subject that we want to flow. So ideally, we hold the brush back here and we stand farther back. And to set a good example, I will do so. Definitely harder to paint. It's going to give us a slightly more randomized look to it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a flame, it moves fairly sporadically. Maybe we'll capture that with a little more randomization. So far, so good. Definitely more risky though. Really, it comes down to what you're comfortable with, but I did want to show you us painting with both ways. Note that they both do have benefits. And disadvantages. You can see that we're building it up every time we do this. It's still looking quite stiff, which is something we need to work through. But we will get there. Again, expanding on that initial flame, building the body. We'll connect a couple of these towards the bottom. There we go. We really don't need that much paint. We're not covering an extremely large area. Something I'm also really feeling the urge to do is expand this out a little bit farther. Here, we don't really have much of a blue. So I feel relatively safe doing some extra applications like that. Not too large, but that one is. Really just feeling it out. There we are. I'm trying to jump around quite a lot as well, because if we stick predominantly in a singular area, we'll probably overwork it. And I also like to do a little bit, see how I feel about it while I paint something else, and then come back to it once I've had time to digest the applications and think a little bit in the background about how I want to continue progressing it. And I know that type of lesson isn't necessarily hyper useful in painting exactly this, but I really do try to make these lessons something that don't just take you from A to B to C to D with the painting, but also give you a lot of larger ideas that you can take with you into your future works, right? I want it to be in large part transferable. So while this part of the painting is a bit more intuitive rather than structured, hopefully these ideas allow it to be intuitive for you, and you can again take them so that other paintings are intuitive as well. Of course, it takes a little bit of time, takes a little bit of practice, and that's alright. With that, we're going brighter. The liner brush isn't great for blending, but we don't need a lot of paint, so we'll just grab some extra titanium white, brighten it up, and have some fun. I'm going to be very careful with this pigment, as it is extremely bright. We don't want to overdo it. Putting it predominantly towards the heart, and then in the very middle of a couple of the other spots. I do want this top area to really stand out, so I'll touch up a little bit of that in the body of a couple of those. It isn't quite as bright as what I have on the palette because of course it's semi-transparent and some of this paint is still wet from previous layers, but it's still quite powerful. You know what, I'm going to take a little bit of the previous mixture because we still have it, and I'm going to add some fire towards the bottom here on this log. Just make it bit more lively. See that? It's wrapping around this log and then it's getting lost behind this one. Then we can have it coming up again. These are things that might look a little bit better, admittedly, if you already have the orange base, and you can go back and remix it. But I think we can make it look really nice without it. It's just a general rule to be extra safe. You start with that more orangey red. But a lot of these ideas are meant to help you, not handcuff you. And I think that's important to remember in all painting scenarios here. I want to give you ideas, I want to guide you, but I don't ever want to tell you exactly what to do. Because so much of painting is individual, your interpretation, and despite the fact that we're all working on the same lesson, it's very likely that our paintings will end up looking quite unique. And that's a beautiful thing. So just because I suggest something doesn't mean you have to follow suit. I'm going to grab a bit of the brighter pigment, add some extra depth to these. Not too much, but enough. I'm also going to add a little bit that's kind of sparking off. So when I come towards the ends, I do this little tap. We're working with something that's quite white at this point, so while it's yellow, it's not really a worry, despite the fact that it's on top of a lot of blue. With that, we're going to do slightly brighter, yet again, one more time. Just more titanium white in the mix. It's not a white here, it's a very warm, bright yellow. Or it's a warm white, or it's a very bright yellow. You know, it's both, but it's something to be very careful with, as you can see. It's just so strong. Only meant for the middle and the areas that you really want to accentuate, which is up here as well. There we go. Building some bodies. Like that. Let's get you a bit closer again. Still, admittedly, quite a bit to do with the fire, but I do want to grab a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, mix those up in the white, get this nice bright pigment, and, as noted recently, just start to add accents, little details, areas that are kind of sparking. Little taps like that. This is going to add so much life to the painting. And we'll do a technique probably in 5-ish minutes, which will really bring it to life, but this is essentially how we start. You can see we're really moving around. Intentionally so. Grab more of that pigment. You can make some areas thick, some thin. Really up to you. There we go. Beautiful. I'm accentuating the ones at the top, because that is an area I like. Can do some farther out, like that. Little sparks flying in all these different directions. Post a big crackle. There we go. Sometimes I just do a little tap rather than a tap and a drag. Again, a lot of focus up here. though we can't make this overly detailed, otherwise it'll overshadow everything else and become unnatural. So it's all a balance, which can be difficult to read when we're this close up, but that's why we frequently take those steps back and why I do try to do quite a bit of this lesson from a distance. There we go. Starting to get some of that magic. Starting to look a bit less stiff. Can also add some really nice tails to the flames with this brush and this pigment. Just elongating them, connecting them, having different portions weave behind and in front others. That's a big part of it. Much like when you paint trees, you want branches to go in front and behind to show depth. The same goes for all of these little wispy pieces. Okay, let's take a couple steps back. Now we can endeavor into one of my favorite parts of painting fire. We're still going to be using the liner brush. We're going to make sure it's nice and damp. We'll grab our titanium white, equal mixture of our blue, half that of our cadmium red, and we should render a nice, bright, somewhat saturated orange. Then we'll grab even more water, thin it out, take our palette, and we're going to put it down. So I'm just going to extend a little portion of my easel to put this down here. Grab a little bit more water on my brush, and if you're familiar with the channel, you know exactly what I'm going to do. We're going to just fling some of this pigment onto that canvas. We do that by just peeling back the bristles, and it gives us a lot of those sparks. We can get hundreds very, very quickly. And why we do this rather than just tapping them onto our canvas is because realistically, we get so many more this way and smaller ones than we ever could with that tapping effect. Just like that. They sometimes can be a bit larger, sometimes they're a bit smaller, but when they're larger, they kind of can give you inspiration how to build out the fire as well, which can be really nice. You can add or take away control by moving the brush forward or back. If you're close, you can generally get more of a line. If you're farther back, it's a wider splatter. So there is some technique to it. And the way you angle your brush can also angle the line. So if you have an area that moves out like this, again, you hold your brush like that, you do this, and then it creates that line. There's one, so I'll create it in this direction. And we'll also create some in the upwards direction. Just like that. Really adds some magic to the painting. You can see that I'm continuously going back. Again, it's not something that just happens. We do have to build it over a period of time. Though I would heavily recommend making sure whatever's behind your canvas is okay with getting a little bit of paint on it. I have a cloth down to ensure that my desk doesn't get covered. But in the past, when I did this, I think for the first year, I wouldn't do that. And I would have my laptop behind with the reference photo up. And that laptop had quite the pattern by the end of that year. And I had quite the lesson. So, just something to consider. Now again, when we do that, we can see different areas kind of form that we like, and we say, oh, so, you know what? I could do an extra piece right there. I could expand on that. Create more in that vicinity. Really gives us more options, ideas. I love it. And you can also go with different oranges for it too, depending upon what you want to do. Another thing, if you didn't end up doing the clouds, you could also paint some stars in this. I think that'd be quite nice, but really like how it's going. Actually, you know what? Maybe we should do some stars. So you're probably wondering, how are we going to do stars this late? I mean, we already have a couple of clouds, we have the reflection of them. Here's the thing. The reflection is essentially in moving water, and it will look like moving water if we remove those movements from the sky. That's fine. So, I think we head back up here. We make the sky a little bit darker. We'll grab our cerulean blue, our Mars black, make something nice and rich, like that. We're going to apply it to the top, just like so. And I know this seems risky, right? We're almost at the end. We almost have a painting we love. But here's the thing. You learn so much more in painting when you are willing to do this sort of thing. And having the end result be something that you like a little bit less as a trade for a lesson is generally worth it. Information is so much more valuable than a singular painting. Also, we're working with acrylics, so if you don't love it, it's okay anyway, because you can let it dry for 5 minutes. Then you can come back, and then from there, you can fix it. So, it's okay in every version of that scenario. Also, you have the benefit of the fact that you are watching a YouTube video, so you can watch me do this before you decide to do it yourself. So if you don't end up loving it, you don't have to do it. But the lesson in this is that sometimes you're going to have these bold ideas, and it's going to be late in the process, and you're going to worry about ruining your painting. And my advice is, go for it. Take the chance. Often, it will be so worth it. You can see that I'm slowly blending down to that lighter blue that we had at the bottom. Started with that darker dark. I'm also dodging some of the clouds minorly. We can do that, we don't have to do that. I'll leave that one, I'll take this one out. We can always go back and re-add them should we want to. Doesn't need to be overly complicated, especially if we're adding stars. Now the question is, how do we go from this hard blend into the soft one? We make our brush quite a bit more watery. We make our mix quite a bit more watery. And we go into what's called a wet into dry blend, which is where we essentially try to get a gradient by just letting the paint run out, turn into water with a very soft application, and then we get a soft transition despite the fact that the original color is still dry. Just like that. So let's make it a little bit more thick up here. There we go. Again, looking for a nice rich blue there. Get a soft blend. There we are. Now, it's nice, dark. Make it a little bit darker. Bring that down. Like so. I think that's perfect for stars. Get this beautiful campfire. We see the sunset. We see stars. Have it all. Very picturesque. Let's grab some white, a little bit of blue. Mix those up. Hint of Mars black, just so it's not too saturated. And for the first set, let's just do some taps. This is going to make very large stars in relation to what we did with the sparks. That's okay. We won't do too many. I'm applying with as little pressure as possible. When I apply with more pressure, they get larger. Just working our way across. There's another area where it'd be ideal to jump around a lot, that way you don't create those patterns. Try to make sure that some are closer together than others, create small clusters. I'm going to create a couple larger ones towards the center to bring the eye towards the center. And then I'm going to grab this pigment, make it very wet, similar to what we've done before. I'm going to put my brush horizontally, fire this across the top. Now, I'll be honest, that many stars looks very unrealistic, especially the larger ones. But I'm not worried, because all we need to do is take some Mars Black, work that into our cerulean blue, hint of titanium white, essentially recreate the darker pigment that we have up here. And we just paint over a collection of the larger ones. Like this. And again, that's why acrylics are such an amazing medium to create art with. If you don't like something, you can try it, give it a go, learn the lesson, and then within 5 minutes you can walk it backwards. Get it back to the way you wanted, try again. Or in this case, I like the stars. I like them a lot. But I just didn't like how many there were. I didn't like how prominent they were. And that's a very easy fix. So that's what we're doing. We're just going in and we're simplifying. Again, you don't need to do the stars, but I love the idea of sunset, stars are coming out, you have the fire. It's just kind of beautiful. Right? There we go. But anyways, I think there we have it. That is our painting for today. As per usual, we'll do a code word at the end. You can leave it in the comments. It's just the word, or you can incorporate it into your sentence if you would like to be part of the 13%. Typically only 13% of people make it to the very end of these lessons. It's always fun to see who does and who doesn't, and everybody else who makes it this far reads your comment will also know that you are part of that group. Always fun to see week after week who gets it. But I'm going to go with the word crackling. We've done it before for a fire lesson, and I think it'll be fun to see it again. There were a lot of great comments last time, people working that in. So you can do that. Also, again, huge thank you to everybody for just watching, being here. Huge thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for really making these lessons happen. Wouldn't be able to do it at all, genuinely, without you. So, thank you for providing these lessons to everybody who's watching. Thank you for providing me with the opportunity to make them. Thank you for just being a supportive type of person. If you're new to the channel and this is your first lesson, subscribe so that you get to watch more of these. I try to make them every other week. But also, check out the Patreon. Up there you can get the traceables, the reference photos, again, images of all of the tubes of paint that I use, all of the brushes for each lesson. You can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic paintings before you jump into your first acrylic painting. All of the ebooks full of traceables. We also have that exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their work, helps each other out. It's a wonderful, beautiful positive community that I'm incredibly proud of. There we go. So there's a lot of fun stuff up there. Would recommend checking it out. I need to put down the brush because I will just keep painting forever. But there we have it. Thank you for being here. I will see you soon with a brand new painting lesson, and I hope that yours ends up just magical. Thank you, and stay creative. Update. I know I ended the video, but it's one of those things where if I have a painting up on the easel, time passes throughout the week, I'm going to pick up the palette and I'm going to continue painting. And here we are. I've decided to add a couple of things that I thought I would bring to your attention. One, I've added a couple of very undistinguishable logs in the background here that kind of line the edge. They act as leading lines that point into kind of towards the fire, as you can see here. And I'll actually paint a couple so you can see exactly what I've done. So we'll grab some of our cerulean blue, our Mars black, a little bit of our burnt umber, titanium white. Get a pigment that's slightly darker than what we have for the background of the sand. And then we want to essentially create some crisscrossing logs that are going to work in the background here and create this look of essentially piled wood on the shoreline. And I'm working in between some of the flames. You can go back and add the sparks if you want to over those areas. But I think it's a really good detail. And then you can just progressively work them forward, make some of them smaller, have larger ones, but I like that idea a lot. Additionally, this area got very complicated with two things. One, the sparks, two, stars. So what I did was I just made, again, a darker variant, essentially that. I went up and I just repainted them. Using the same brush, we used some tapping along the top, and I just started bringing that over from the left-hand side to the right. Again, more layers just typically make the painting look more professional anyway. Have to be pretty delicate as we dance around these flames, but it does let you refine them should you want to. And I just took out all of those added details that we don't really need. We also want to do a little bit of that in the reflection. Not too much, because we do still want some sparks. Again, I think that's what adds so much magic. But we can definitely clean up the painting through there and add some extra detail right there. So, with that, that is the true conclusion to the painting. I really do hope you enjoyed. I hope the extra tips were helpful. Remember, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you really soon with the next one. Enjoy the process, and yet again, stay creative.